Imagine waking up on a quiet Tuesday morning where everything feels perfectly safe, only to watch a lifetime of disciplined saving and hard work vanish before the sun goes down. The morning routine is undisturbed, the neighborhood is calm, and the digital balances in your brokerage account look exactly as robust as they did yesterday. Yet, an invisible financial earthquake is already in motion. But somewhere in the digital shadows of global trading hubs, the financial ground is already breaking apart. You go to sleep feeling completely secure in your diversified portfolio, blissfully unaware that by tomorrow afternoon, the generational wealth you spent decades carefully building will be reduced to fractions of a penny on the dollar by automated liquidation algorithms. A catastrophic financial collapse does not happen slowly over months or years. It strikes in brutal real time, starting with a single spark of institutional fear that spreads from one major hedge fund to the next like a highly contagious sickness. Within minutes, a localized liquidity crisis mutates into a global panic that paralyzes central banks. One overleveraged firm decides to dump its assets to cover immediate debts, and then a dozen rival institutions follow suit, triggering a chilling chain reaction of pure, unadulterated market panic. On trading floors in New York and server farms in Chicago, steady green numbers flash violent red as hundreds of billions of dollars in market capitalization simply evaporate into thin air before lunch. The deepest psychological mystery of these recurring economic disasters is why the general public almost never sees them coming. The mathematical warning signs are always there, written in plain sight within obscure bond yield curves and corporate debt ratios, screaming to anyone willing to look that the systemic danger is absolutely real and rapidly approaching a critical threshold. Yet, society collectively chooses to look away from the mounting data. We fall victim to a dark cognitive flaw known as normalcy bias, deliberately blinding ourselves to the ugly truth of unsustainable market valuations, because the intoxicating dream of endless, effortless wealth feels entirely too good to let go of. The delusion becomes more comforting than the reality. This collective cultural dream creates what financial historians officially classify as a market bubble. Think of it like a highly pressurized rubber balloon, blown up much too fast by institutional greed, reckless lending practices, and the wild, blind hope of amateur investors who believe traditional economic gravity no longer applies to their chosen assets. Millions of people just keep pumping their hard-earned salary deposits and retirement contributions into something completely mathematically hollow. The structural skin of this economic balloon stretches thinner and thinner with every passing quarter, eventually holding nothing but the hot air of inflated corporate earnings reports and the empty promises of venture capitalists seeking a quick exit. That fragile synthetic balloon of speculative greed can only stretch so far before the internal pressure of mounting corporate defaults and rising interest rates becomes vastly too much for the underlying financial architecture to support. The mathematics of debt eventually demand to be paid, and the system reaches an absolute breaking point where no new money can enter. Then comes the terrifying, inevitable moment when the rubber finally snaps. There is almost always an eerie, breathless silence in the global markets right before the catastrophic pop, a split second of frozen liquidity where credit markets seize up entirely and the financial world seems to hold its collective breath in anticipation of the coming slaughter. In that exact, devastating second, the collective illusion of permanent prosperity shatters completely. The speculative fog instantly clears, and tens of millions of everyday people realize with sudden, stomach-dropping horror that the paper wealth they thought they securely held in their brokerage accounts was never actually real money to begin with. It was only a temporary digital mirage. When the digital dust finally settles across the global exchanges, the very real human tragedy left behind is deep and crushing. Hardworking families who followed every rule and did everything right suddenly find themselves facing aggressive foreclosure notices, eventually pushed out of their suburban homes with their entire lives packed into cheap cardboard boxes left sitting on the sidewalk. Elderly men and women watch completely helplessly as the conservative mutual funds and pension plans they meant to survive on are brutally wiped out in a single Tuesday afternoon. A dark, heavy economic despair settles over entire working-class neighborhoods, leaving a tragic trail of broken marriages, shattered health, and ruined lives in the immediate wake of the burst. That crushing, relentless wave of financial despair does not just hurt the wealthy derivative traders operating out of glass penthouses on Wall Street. The catastrophic damage bleeds rapidly outward from the financial sector, infecting the broader economy and destroying the livelihoods of millions of people who never even knew what a credit default swap was. It comes aggressively right to your front door, pulling hard on the invisible macroeconomic strings tied directly to your own daily life and employment. You are permanently locked into this wildly volatile system right now, bound by the rigid mechanics of modern banking, even if you never intentionally open a brokerage account or trade a single stock yourself. The purchasing power of your checking account, the viability of your employer-sponsored retirement funds, and the expensive future plans you hold dear for your children are all hanging by that exact same fragile economic thread. When the global market violently shakes under the weight of institutional failure, your carefully constructed personal safety net shakes right along with it. Those hidden, deeply embedded structural ties mean you are never truly insulated or safe from the sudden, violent shock of a cascading market crash. The financial contagion does not respect geographical boundaries, social class, or careful budgeting, sweeping through the middle class with a ruthless efficiency that leaves ordinary citizens scrambling to cover their most basic living expenses. To truly understand exactly how deep this systemic danger goes, we must step back into the dark, foundational history of the infamous 1929 stock market crash. The glittering era, widely known as the Roaring Twenties, was entirely built on a dangerous, drunken financial greed, creating a toxic environment where almost everyone was aggressively buying speculative equities using borrowed margin money they simply did not have. The air in the late 1920s was thick with a dangerous, blind greed as the American public embraced the perilous practice of buying on margin. People from all walks of life were purchasing shares with money they did not even have, putting down as little as 10% of the purchase price. They borrowed heavily from brokerage firms and local banks, convinced the market would only ever go up, building their entire financial futures on a fragile mountain of debt. It was a golden party, but the floor beneath them was completely hollow. That mountain of borrowed money was a mechanical trap waiting to snap shut on the American middle class. By the autumn of 1929, outstanding broker loans had reached a staggering $8.5 billion, which was more than the total amount of currency circulating in the entire United States at the time. Then came the dark morning of October 29, 1929, forever known as Black Tuesday. The golden illusion shattered in an instant as stock prices violently plunged without warning under the weight of 16 million traded shares. Inside the trading rooms, the air turned to pure panic as the ticker tape fell hours behind the actual plunging prices. Men screamed, wept, and tore at their collars as they watched their life savings vanish into thin air in a matter of hours. The true horror set in when the market finally closed, and massive margin calls began flooding the telegraph wires. Those who had borrowed money to buy stocks suddenly owed debts they could never repay, forcing them to liquidate everything they owned. The banks came calling for their cash to cover the bad loans, but the vaults were rapidly emptying as terrified depositors rushed to withdraw their funds. The paper wealth was entirely gone, leaving behind only crushed dreams and a terrifying silence across the financial district. The stock market crash did not just erase arbitrary numbers on a ledger, it fundamentally broke the economic back of the entire country. Over the next 3 years, the United States gross national product plummeted by nearly 50%, dragging the global economy into the deepest and most destructive depression in modern history. The grim years that followed painted a chilling picture of basic human survival as the national unemployment rate skyrocketed to 25%. Steel mills and automobile factories went dark, their massive iron gates chained shut, while proud industrial workers were thrown out into the cold streets. Long, desperate lines formed in major cities just to get a single piece of bread or a bowl of thin soup from charity kitchens. Millions of families lost their homes to foreclosure, wandering the dusty roads in search of any manual labor they could find. This was not just a catastrophic loss of capital, it was the crushing of a society's fundamental optimism. A deep, lingering trauma settled over the survivors after watching 9,000 different banks fail and wipe out 9 million individual savings accounts. This psychological scarring taught a whole generation to hide physical cash in their mattresses and never trust a financial institution again. They learned the brutal lesson that the banking machine operates without empathy, and it will systematically take everything if you are not fiercely protective of your assets. Fast forward to the late 1990s, and a completely new financial deception was quietly taking root in Silicon Valley. The commercialization of the internet felt like limitless magic, and the wildly successful public offering of early web browsers sparked an untamed frenzy across the global markets. A new rush for digital gold began on the Nasdaq exchange, pulling ordinary retail investors away from their steady index funds and back into the dangerous game of chasing effortless wealth. Anyone with a basic computer and a vague business plan could suddenly start a technology company, often just by adding .com to their name. Retail investors began throwing their entire life savings at new internet businesses that had never manufactured a product or made a single dime in actual profit. The traditional rules of money were completely thrown out the window. They were replaced by a blind, dangerous faith in a new economic paradigm where everyone believed this time was fundamentally different. The digital gold rush was built on nothing but glowing computer screens, massive corporate cash burn rates, and entirely empty promises. Instead of measuring actual sales revenue, these startup founders successfully convinced the entire financial sector to value their fledgling companies based purely on website clicks, user eyeballs, and theoretical future market dominance. The most unsettling mystery of this era was how incredibly educated people on Wall Street were systematically fooled by such an obvious economic lie. Respected financial analysts, prominent news anchors, and normal retail traders alike all looked at e-commerce businesses bleeding millions of dollars a month and called them brilliant, visionary investments. They completely convinced themselves that actual operating profits no longer mattered in this shiny, frictionless new digital world. It was a chilling textbook display of mass financial delusion fueled by cheap credit. When everyone around you believes a fundamental lie, like a pet supply website spending millions on television advertisements despite having no revenue, that lie starts to feel like the absolute truth. The intense psychological fear of missing out on the easy money blinded both amateur day traders and seasoned institutional investors to the massive, jagged cliff they were all sprinting toward. The brutal awakening finally hit the markets in March of the year 2000, just as the Federal Reserve began aggressively raising interest rates. The endless flow of venture capital funding suddenly dried up overnight, and the heavy curtain was pulled back to reveal the ugly underlying truth. Hundreds of these celebrated internet companies actually had no real business model, no loyal paying customers, and absolutely no way to survive the coming economic storm. The sheer speed of the technology sector collapse was terrifying to watch unfold. Multi-billion-dollar corporate empires vanished into thin air in a matter of days, as the Nasdaq Composite Index plummeted by an astonishing 78% from its peak. Stock prices that had previously climbed to the moon crashed violently back down to mere pennies, wiping out roughly $5 trillion of investment wealth in the blink of an eye. The shiny new era of the internet had rapidly turned into a dark, inescapable financial nightmare for those caught inside the immediate blast radius. Office furniture and expensive computer servers from hundreds of bankrupt technology startups were suddenly being auctioned off for pennies on the dollar in empty parking lots across California. The hardest hit victims were the everyday programmers and marketing workers who had believed the corporate hype with all their hearts, often accepting company shares instead of a steady salary. Thousands of young employees showed up to their shiny new tech offices one morning, only to find the heavy glass doors padlocked shut from the inside by bankruptcy lawyers. Their promised jobs were permanently gone, and the restricted stock options they thought would make them millionaires were suddenly completely worthless. They had traded their safe, predictable careers for a doomed ticket on a rapidly sinking ship. Middle-class families who had risked their 401k retirement funds on the seemingly unstoppable internet boom were left staring at empty brokerage accounts, wondering how they had been so easily tricked by television analysts. The grand digital illusion had permanently shattered, leaving behind a devastating trail of broken financial promises, delayed retirements, and deeply ruined lives. Once again, the stock market had ruthlessly demonstrated its cyclical, cruel ability to steal absolutely everything from those who trusted its momentum the most. The inevitable crash operated as a brutal wealth destruction machine, punishing the very people who arrived late to the party and believed the good times would last forever. The year 2008 uncovered a deep and terrible rot hidden right in plain sight within the American financial system. Powerful banks, driven by pure greed, started handing out huge home loans to everyday people who could never afford to pay them back. These were known as subprime mortgages and ninja loans given to borrowers with no income, no job, and no assets to their name. Instead of keeping these bad loans on their own books, the banks tied them together into shiny new packages called collateralized debt obligations. They paid rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's to stamp these poisoned bundles with fake seals of approval, securing top TPA ratings. They then sold them to the rest of the world, including global pension funds, as perfectly safe investments. It was a giant financial lie built on thousands of smaller, documented lies, waiting in the dark to destroy families. Mortgage brokers routinely falsified income statements and used predatory lending tactics to target vulnerable working-class neighborhoods. The entire scheme relied on the dangerous illusion that housing prices would perpetually increase, masking the toxic reality that the underlying debt was completely worthless. The most chilling part was that the people supposed to protect the public simply looked the other way. The experts, the rulemakers, and institutions like the Securities and Exchange Commission watched the danger grow, but they chose to stay silent. Federal Reserve officials ignored stark warnings about predatory lending, while regulators allowed themselves to be entirely captured by powerful Wall Street lobbying efforts. As long as the money kept flowing and the rich kept getting richer, no one wanted to turn on the lights. They left the monsters hiding in the shadows, hoping the endless party of multi-million-dollar Wall Street bonuses would never stop. Investment firms like Lehman Brothers recklessly multiplied the risk, leveraging $30 of borrowed debt for every single dollar of actual capital they held. Then, the music stopped abruptly in September 2008, and the giant banks began to fall one by one. Behind closed doors, in scared and secret weekend meetings at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, leaders realized the terrifying truth. The catastrophic collapse of Lehman Brothers sent a lethal shockwave through the global markets, exposing the staggering fragility of the modern banking architecture. The entire global money system was suddenly frozen, just days away from completely shutting down. The commercial paper market, which corporations use to make weekly payroll, ground to an absolute halt. If the cash stopped moving, international shipping letters of credit would stall, food would stop arriving at grocery stores, and normal daily life across the globe would end in an instant. The leaders printed massive amounts of money overnight just to keep the economic machines running for one more day. Through the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the government engineered a $700 billion bailout of the very institutions that caused the crisis. The Federal Reserve initiated unprecedented quantitative easing, flooding the financial system with trillions of dollars in artificial liquidity to prevent a total systemic collapse. While the massive banks got saved from their own reckless gambling, everyday people faced a brutal, unforgiving nightmare. A wave of lost homes swept across the country, crushing neighborhoods and breaking hearts from Nevada to Florida. Nearly 10 million Americans were displaced as foreclosure notices were nailed to front doors, entirely wiping out decades of hard-earned middle-class wealth in a matter of months. Families spent their nights packing up their whole lives into the trunks of their cars and rented moving trucks. They drove away from the homes they loved, punished for a rigged financial game played by men in expensive suits. While tent cities emerged in the shadows of major metropolitan areas, banking executives kept their massive corporate bonuses as working-class taxpayers footed the enormous bailout bill. Years of hard work vanished into thin air, leaving behind empty streets and completely broken trust in the American financial system. Over $16 trillion in household net worth was vaporized during the crash. Entire suburban neighborhoods transformed into ghost towns of half-finished housing developments decaying in the sun, leaving a permanent, devastating scar on a generation of workers who played by the rules. When you look closely at the Black Tuesday margin calls of 1929, the dot-com bubble bursting in 2000, and the subprime contagion of 2008, a dark pattern shows up in the wreckage. The core disease is always exactly the same. Despite the different technological eras and the varying financial instruments used, the exact same underlying pathology drives the market toward inevitable, catastrophic destruction. It is human greed, the dangerous trap of easy money, and the foolish, recurring belief that this time will somehow be different. This cycle of speculative mania is a strict law of human nature, repeating over and over again. Central banks artificially lower interest rates, inflating massive asset bubbles, while investors operate under the collective delusion that fundamental economic laws have been permanently suspended. This brings us to a deep and unsettling truth that you must face right now regarding your own financial security. Another crash is coming, and it cannot be stopped by any government intervention. The mathematical certainty of market cycles, combined with national debt to GDP ratios reaching unprecedented historical highs, guarantees that the sheer impossibility of infinite exponential growth in a finite financial system will trigger a collapse. These dark events are not random accidents or simple bad luck, because they are built right into the very system we use to live and trade. The clock is already ticking loudly in the background, counting down to the next severe storm. Fractional reserve banking requires constant credit expansion, and massive corporate debt mountains require constant refinancing, meaning the underlying architecture of modern finance demands periodic catastrophic resets. The pressure is building under the surface again, waiting for the perfect, unexpected moment to violently break. Overvalued technology stocks are currently carrying trillion-dollar valuations disconnected from underlying reality. Meanwhile, massive commercial real estate portfolios are masking staggering unrealized losses, and regional banks are quietly teetering on the edge of insolvency, creating a highly combustible environment that only needs a single spark to ignite. But hidden inside this terrifying reality is a shocking twist that separates the victims from the victors. While the uninformed crowd loses everything they have built, a very small group of prepared people actually survive the crash without suffering catastrophic losses. Institutional investors quietly accumulate cash reserves, contrarian asset managers shift capital into defensive positions, and disciplined individuals master the mechanics of hedging their portfolios against severe downturns. They do not just survive the financial carnage, they quietly build massive wealth while the rest of the world panics and sells at the absolute bottom. For them, a market collapse is not the end of the world, but the greatest wealth-building chance of their lives. By acquiring distressed real estate for pennies on the dollar and buying premium assets at steep discounts, they execute calculated strategies that transform financial devastation into generational fortunes. The hidden truth remains that those with deep pockets always knew how to survive the storm, leaving the rest of us searching for their secret. That secret is not magic, but a careful plan called diversification. Think of your money as a giant ship crossing a dark, icy ocean. If the ship is just one big open room, a single hole from an iceberg will fill it with water and drag it down to the bottom. Everything is lost in minutes. But builders learned a clever trick to cheat death at sea. They divided the ship into many smaller, locked rooms. If ice tears open one room, heavy steel doors seal shut, keeping the water trapped inside that single space. The rest of the ship stays dry, safe, and moving forward, no matter how cold and violent the ocean gets. Spreading your money across different places builds those heavy steel doors around your life. Imagine the pure terror of putting every dollar you own into one single company. When bad news strikes and that company starts to fail, you are trapped on a sinking ship with no lifeboats. You watch the red numbers drop on your screen, feeling a cold sweat as years of hard work just vanish into thin air. Now picture the quiet relief of the person who spread their money around. They watch that same company crash, but their heart does not race. They know their safety net is tied to many different strong posts, and the snapping of one single rope will not drop them into the abyss. They sleep soundly while others panic. But the strongest shield you can build is completely boring. It is a simple pile of cash, locked away in a safe bank account, waiting for the worst day of your life. We call it an emergency fund. When the market crashes and the banks suddenly refuse to lend anyone a single dime, this boring money becomes your heavy armor. In a real panic, credit cards stop working and loans disappear overnight. If you lose your job while the world is burning, you cannot pay for food with falling stocks. Having 6 months of living costs sitting in plain cash means you do not have to sell your investments at a terrible loss just to survive the week. In the bitter winter of 2008, a factory worker in Ohio kept his family home out of foreclosure simply because he had quietly saved $10,000 in a local bank vault over 5 years. There is another trick that feels completely wrong, but works like a hidden superpower. It is called dollar cost averaging. This means you buy a small, set amount of investments every single month, no matter what the news says. You do it when the sun is shining, and you do it when the sky is falling. When the market is bleeding and prices hit rock bottom, everyone else runs away in fear. But your automatic plan steps into the shadows and buys more shares than ever, picking up broken pieces for pennies. It is a chillingly effective way to turn a worldwide panic into your own quiet advantage. This steady rhythm of buying turns the terrifying drops of a market crash into the greatest opportunity of a lifetime. Yet the darkest battle you will face is not against the banks or the brokers. The real war is fought inside your own head. Human nature is wired to run away from pain and danger. When you see your life savings cut in half, every alarm bell in your brain screams at you to sell everything and hide. It takes a strange kind of strength to ignore those screaming alarms. Our ancestors survived by running away from fires and wild beasts. Today, that same survival instinct will trick you into destroying your own wealth, pushing you to sell at the exact moment you should be holding on tight. Winning this silent war against your own fear is the only way to make it out of the crash alive. Think of the lonely people who held their ground during the darkest hours of past crashes. They sat in quiet rooms, staring at glowing screens that flashed bright red, watching their net worth melt away. Friends and family begged them to sell, calling them fools for staying on a sinking ship. But they possessed a quiet, iron courage. They did absolutely nothing. They trusted the heavy steel doors of their safety net. They trusted their boring cash, and they trusted their steady buying plan. They swallowed their fear, closed their eyes, and let the storm rage outside, knowing they had built a fortress that could not be broken. That brave stillness in the face of total ruin is the ultimate secret to surviving the inevitable collapse. Building a fortified wall of liquid cash and spreading your capital across different asset classes like treasury bonds and precious metals literally alters your financial future. When the broader market falls apart and indices drop 20 or 30%, that deliberate preparation turns a massive disaster into a temporary obstacle. Instead of losing everything to a sudden margin call, you merely lose a little time. The economic storm still hits your portfolio, but your foundation is constructed of solid brick instead of vulnerable dry straw. The deep psychological and economic pain of past crashes forced the global financial system to fundamentally change how institutional money works. In the direct aftermath of the 2008 subprime mortgage collapse, federal regulators and lawmakers implemented the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, writing thousands of pages of new regulations designed to put heavy operational chains on the biggest Wall Street banks. These stringent new rules forced financial institutions to keep massive piles of emergency cash reserves permanently locked away in the dark. Every single year, the Federal Reserve now runs a strict economic stress test, forcing these megabanks to mathematically prove they can survive a sudden, catastrophic market disaster without requiring a taxpayer bailout and pulling the whole country down with them. But those new federal banking rules could not undo the catastrophic damage already inflicted upon ordinary working families. Between 2007 and 2010, nearly 10 million people walked away from foreclosed properties, leaving behind empty rooms, boarded-up windows, and completely shattered financial hopes that took decades to rebuild. A whole generation of young workers watched their parents lose absolutely everything to predatory lending and collapsing stock portfolios, and that dark, lingering fear never truly went away. This demographic learned to trust no one on Wall Street with their money, forever scarred by the terrifying autumn days when major investment firms vanished and the global credit market simply stopped working. This generational fear is even heavier today because of a quiet legislative change made several decades ago. In 1978, a completely obscure provision in the Internal Revenue Code accidentally created the 401k, systematically shifting the heavy financial weight of retirement funding away from corporate employers and directly onto the inexperienced shoulders of normal, everyday workers. The old, reliable safety net of a promised corporate pension quickly faded into history, replaced by accounts tied directly to Wall Street performance. Now, every public school teacher, hospital nurse, and construction builder is forced to ride the dangerous, unpredictable waves of the global stock market all by themselves, assuming all the financial risk of a sudden downturn. This harsh economic reality leaves behind a haunting, systemic question that no financial expert can confidently answer. If nearly everyone in the modern workforce is now forced to play the volatile equities market just to survive old age, what exactly happens to society when the next giant, inevitable crash wipes out trillions of dollars in retirement savings all at once? We still do not know if the new banking regulations and liquidity rules are actually strong enough to save us from a modern, algorithm-driven panic. The true, terrifying test will only come when the next massive asset bubble bursts, and millions of older workers suddenly find out if the digital numbers representing their life savings will actually be there to withdraw. Because of this deep, underlying fear of sudden ruin, a completely new kind of defensive strategy has quietly taken over the retail financial world. Millions of everyday people now utilize automated investment programs that instantly pull a designated percentage of cash from every single paycheck, depositing it into diversified index funds before the worker can even see the money in their primary checking account. This remarkably simple behavioral system completely removes destructive human emotion and panic selling from the choice to save. By putting long-term wealth building on strict autopilot, the modern technology essentially forces people to prepare for the worst economic outcomes without ever having to obsess over the scary financial headlines broadcasting on the evening news. For the young, anxious worker looking at their banking application on a mobile phone today, that quiet, automated habit serves as a critical financial lifeline. When the red lines on the trading screen point violently downward and sudden panic fills the trading floors, they do not have to feel the paralyzing terror that financially destroyed the working generations that came before them. Instead of panicking, they can just look at that boring, untouched emergency fund containing 6 months of living expenses, sitting safely in a federally insured bank account. It is a wonderfully simple pile of liquid cash, resting quietly in the dark, entirely separated from Wall Street volatility, and fully ready to catch them when the economic world finally falls apart.